You know you're in for an exciting game when neither side ever castles the king for the entire game, and that's exactly what we saw in this encounter between Sergei Karjakin with white and Alireza Firouzja with black. So this was played in Norway Chess 2021, it was their classical game and both players were up for a fight, as we'll see here. And if you love a daily chess video, do hit that subscribe button to never miss one. So we had this Sicilian on board, we had these standard opening moves, and we headed down this open Sicilian into the Najdorf variation. So after this knight c3 move, we had pawn to a6. This starts the Najdorf. And now we had pawn to h3 from Sergei. An interesting sideline here, it's known as the Adams attack, not named after the famous English grandmaster Michael Adams, but after an American master called Weaver Adams, who was playing this in the 40s. So it's an interesting idea. You prepare g4 later on. It's a very flexible move. Now there are different ways for black to play, of course, but e5 was chosen by Firouzja. So he kicks this knight back. It comes to f3. More common's actually bringing it to e2, but okay, Sergei comes to f3. So you've given white this d5 square, as we note, but black is going to get some dynamic play in compensation for that. You've also gained time and you've gained central space here. So now we had bishop to e7 developing and pawn to g4, this classic break in the Adams attack. Pawn to h6 was played by Firouzja. He prepares to meet g5 with a recapture. We had rook to g1 from Sergei, further preparing that move. And now Firouzja plays an interesting move of queen to c7 here. So he delays the development of these minor pieces. He's probably not quite sure yet whether he wants that bishop on e6 or whether he wants to go b5, bishop b7. Both plans are feasible. And now I don't love the way in which Sergei plays this position. So I think here he should have carried on with pawn to g5 for the simple reason that it fits into the overall plan which he's aiming for with his pieces. If Firouzja recaptures here, which is best, then he jumps in with that knight and he gives meaning to the knight actually moving to f3, the rook coming to the g-file because now it's ripped open. But with the way Sergei plays it, he goes knight to h4 here. So he's coming into this f5 square and Firouzja now blocks that with g6, and maybe Sergei is making a case for having weakened this f6 square. But the problem is after knight to g2, bishop to e6, knight to e3 here, he's now moved that same piece, this knight here, 6 times in his first 12 moves, you know, breaking opening principles. And if we look at Alireza's pieces after this move, knight b to d7, he's got 5 pieces developed here to white's 2. And I wouldn't say that this rook is any better placed than this rook, which hasn't actually moved. And what we'll see is the g-file never actually opens. So it begs the question, what's this rook doing there? So pawn to h4 now came from Sergei. He tries to get something going on the king side, but queen to c6 in response, just probing against this e4 pawn, reminding white of this weakness. So queen f3 came now, defending that e4 pawn, also looking at this f6 square which has been weakened. Knight to c5 from Firouzja, he renews the threat of taking the pawn, and now bishop g2 is played to defend that e4 pawn. But as we can see, Firouzja's clearly won the opening battle here. This rook is now blocked, this bishop's just staring passively at his own pawn, but you do have to be careful here now as black. So if you get too casual here, say you castle the king, which looks really logical, you bring it to safety, you develop your final piece, well then this g5 move actually carries a punch. So after you capture, pawn recaptures, this knight doesn't really have a good place to go. Say you drop it back into d7 for example, well then white jumps in here onto this juicy d5 square that you weakened earlier on. That's why this knight getting kicked is so powerful. And this isn't a nice position for black, white has seized the initiative. But if we just bring it back here to before castle's queenside, if instead you play as Firouzja did, knight to a4, this is precise, really classy stuff from these super GMs. And the whole idea is that now if you go pawn to g5, same line, captures, captures, you drop the knight back, yes, But here, if you jump this knight in now, then after captures here on c3, we're getting a pair of knights off the board. The bishop is covering this square adequately. And if you go with the other knight instead, you may wonder, say if you jump with this knight, try and make this one look silly, well now your g5 point is defended by the bishop, so black can actually take here, they've won a pawn, they're doing well. So subtle stuff, but that's why knight a4 is so much more powerful than castle's queenside. We now had the knight jumping in here, we had knight takes on c3 from Firouzja, and here Sergei decides to capture the knight on f6. He could take this one back on c3, say like this, or with the queen, but black's now seizing the initiative, and you can actually take this pawn here on g4 as we note. So that's why instead Sergei took here with check. The bishop recaptured, and the queen dived in, hitting this rook on h8 here. So you can't castle queenside to protect it, because you're coming through this line from the queen. If you go kingside, then this is leading to checkmate on g7. And so instead of this, Firouzja played king to d7 here. A beautiful way to connect the rooks, and the king is actually very safe, sat behind these pawns and the pieces around it. And it's actually white's king that's now coming under fire. So you can't take here on c3, or the queen recaptures with check. You're picking up this rook in the corner. And also we note that this e4 pawn is attacked by two pieces from black. So if Sergei were to drop the queen back and defend it like this, well now we can actually pick up this pawn on a2, supported by this bishop here. And this is really powerful because you're also then coming to b4 to attack c2. Now if you try c3 to trap in that knight, well we simply take on c1. Black's doing really well here. So Sergei wanted to keep some counterplay going, and that's why coming back to this position here, he played pawn to g5. Giving this pawn on e4, which Firouzja took. And now you don't want to allow Firouzja to take here. You might wonder, well, what if I go, say, pawn to c3? Let black capture here. I pick up here on c6 with check. Recaptures, recaptures. Well, this is bad because you're a pawn down as white and you're in an endgame with no hope. So Sergei wants to keep mixing it up, keep the queens on the board. So he played queen to f3 here instead. But Firouzja now achieves this d5 move, a key move in Najdorf structures, because now you liberate the black position. He's also holding this knight here, of course, and he's a pawn up. So queen to d1 was now played. There's a threat to take this knight here, using the pin against the king. And again, Firouzja finds the best response in the position. Pause if you want to look for it. He plays queen to b6. Really subtle, because if you take this knight now, using the pin, then queen b4 check comes. And after a block like this, you pick up the bishop on e4. So we didn't have this move played by Sergei. He didn't chop the knight. Instead, again, he went for the active response of bishop to e3. So there was also a checkmating threat here on f2, I should say. So the e3 bishop move blocks that checkmate, but now Firouzja picks up the pawn on b2. Now we had bishop takes on e4, but once again, same tactic, queen b4 check was played. We had c3 blocking and the queen picked up here. So the rook now came to the b file, hitting this pawn, and once again Firouzja goes for the jugular. He doesn't passively defend this pawn with pawn to b5. It's still very good for black, but it's just not the best move. Instead, he plays pawn takes on g5, and he's looking to rip open this h-file to bring this rook down here or here, bring it into the attack. He also has threats of d4 here, because this bishop is pinned to the king, as we note. And that's why Sergei goes rook to b4 here, preparing to pin that pawn on d4. Now he could have taken with check first, forced the king back, but he decided to do it in this order, and we'll see Firouzja retreat soon anyway. So the pawn kicked on to d4, we had captures here, and now Firouzja tucks that king back. We had pawn takes on g5 now by Sergei. The rook came down to h3, pressuring here as we note. So king d2 protected that e3 square, got out of the pins, and now bishop to f5. Lovely activation of that bishop, looking at this d3 square. So the queen came out to b3 now. And here Firouzja brings the final piece into the attack, the rook comes to the c-file, and there's deadly threats now happening on c2, you can't afford to ignore that, so the other rook comes across, defends that c-file. And now a really simple way to proceed, Firouzja chops here, the king recaptures, and he brings that rook down to h1. The king steps back to d2, now we had pawn to b5, we had pawn to d5 from Sergei, he opens up this attack on the queen, but after queen to f3, Sergei actually resigned. The position is hopeless. Just to show one line here, say you play pawn to a4, trying to rip open here, generate some play. Well, now there's many ways to win, but let's say rook b1 was played. This is one of the cleanest and simplest. You're actually forcing the queen to give up for the rook and bishop, which is a completely winning endgame, because if you play queen a3, it's mate in 2. If you duck with queen c3, then this is mate in 1. To see Firouzja crushing Richard Rapport in this same tournament, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.